My name is Chad Daly. I work here I'm one of the organizers of the Central Wisconsin Book Festival, and very happy to have Kristen Whitson and Jenny Kalvaitis with us to talk about their book, We Will Always Be Here. Have just a very short video to share with you, and then we will be back and get things underway. One moment, please. Hello, and welcome to the 2021 Central Wisconsin Book Festival. Before we begin, we would like to thank those organizations and businesses that help make this year's festival possible.
Our presenting sponsors and benefactors this year are
the Community Arts Grant Program and Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin,
with funds provided by the Wisconsin Arts Board,
the Community Foundation,
the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation,
the Marathon County Public Library Foundation,
Ware,
and the Covantage Cares Foundation.
Our 2021 sustainers are Wisconsin Humanities,
with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities,
the Portage County Public Library Foundation.
Other supporters include
the Marathon County Public Library,
the Portage County Public Library,
McMillan Memorial Library,
the Friends of the Marathon County Public Library,
the Marathon County Historical Society,
Whitewater Music Hall,
Wisconsin Public Radio,
and Janke Bookstore.
Thank you so much to all of our sponsors and supporters.
And thanks to you.
Thanks to you.
And thanks to you.
And thank you to you.
Thanks to you.
all of our authors, all of our readers,
And thanks to you for being part of the Central Wisconsin Book Festival.
All right, and let me get back so it doesn't. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We do have Jenny Kalvaitis and Kristen Whitson, excuse me. Jenny has a master's degree in public history from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and she has worked in informal education and museum education for over 10 years. Kristen Whitson has a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she has worked in digital preservation, community and indigenous archives, and LGBTQ+ archives. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to talk to you today about our book, We Will Always Be Here. I'm going to pull up our PowerPoint right now. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. So Kristen, I will go ahead and let you kick it off.
Sounds good. So thank you all so much for being here today. We're pretty excited to share a little bit about this book, some of the history of how it came about, and then the history that's contained in the book, and a little bit about ourselves. And I closed that window, so I can't, I'm just going to trust you, Jenny, that you are advancing those slides.
I am, and we're on today's presentation, the outline.
Great, thank you. So this is our little roadmap for today. We're going to tell you a little bit about how this book came about, why this source material and why now, and then we'll dive into those sources, sharing one chapter per source with you and reading a bit from each chapter. And then towards the end, we'll do a little bit of question and answer if we want to, or share a little bit about what is next in this particular initiative. We'd be glad to take questions at the end, but feel free to put them in the chat or ask as we proceed.
Okay, beautiful. So often when talking about our book, we're asked, like, how did we get here? So we like to start with kind of a level set of from the beginning. And ultimately, people that we would identify as being part of the LGBTQ community have been in Wisconsin for as long as, this land that we know of as Wisconsin has been in existence. Early sources are just harder to locate. And sources can be hard to find in general, but honestly, there is genuine interest among our youth to know about these stories about LGBTQ activism. And I say this from experience. For over 10 years, I've been judging or taking part in some form in a program called National History Day, which allows students to choose topics and then research about the past and kind of come up with their own analysis when looking at historical sources. And consistently, every year that I've been a part of it, you see projects on the Lavender Menace, on Stonewall, on the Well, on it's really clear ultimately that our youth want to know these stories, and every generation has had to fight to find stories of people like them. But the amazing thing is that all of those things are changing now. And this book is a direct outgrowth of the work of Dr. Richard Wagner. And Wagner really is kind of the best human to have written the 2-volume gay history series. He wrote the books you can see on the screen here, We've Been Here All Along, as well as the book coming out moving forward. And he's so amazing to have really brought these works into fruition because he lived much of the history. He collected that work and he has his PhD in history. So he is the best human to really put all that together. And as part of the fundraising efforts for making these books a reality, the groups and donors that he worked with also truly believe that there should be a teen outreach piece. And they wanted something that would tell that story about Wisconsin's unique LGBTQ activism to that teen audience. So the question then was, well, what are we going to do? And I was the coordinator of secondary education at the time for the Wisconsin Historical Society, and they came to me for almost everything teen. So we, sat down with Dick's books and really looked at the analysis that he had and thought about how we would connect some of that content to our teen audience, and ultimately ended up turning to the best practices of what was happening in classrooms across the country. And best practices really going back to the source, back to the material from the time. And so that's what we wanted to make the core of our book, is kind of this primary source reader with some contextual information that was really going to focus on activism, but also feature a strong teen voice. You'll see bubbles like the one on the screen here throughout our talk, because we really actually included modern teen voices in the creation of this book. And we'll talk more about how and why and when. But thankfully, at the beginning of this process, when I was just starting to really get overwhelmed with all of the work, I connected again with the fabulous Kristen Whitson at a conference, and her archival expertise and my educational background really came together to form the perfect partnership that would allow us to create this book. So this book that I've referred to a couple of times now, right? We Have Always Been Here, is really organized based on what we call our spectrum of activism. And as we go forward, we will outline what each of these forms of activism are. I like calling them our spectrum for a couple of reasons. One is it really isn't anything that's set or solid. These actions can change, just like you're moving back and forth on an entire spectrum, just like you can with identity. Identity is fluid. And also, of course, the idea of spectrums or rainbows being associated with the LGBTQ movement just makes it a really fun analogy for us in that way as well. So ultimately, one of the things that we really want to put forward with our spectrum of activism, though, is that no one of these actions is better, harder, worse than another. All of these actions are important forms of activism. And we do like to note that we are definitely aware that the word activism can be a loaded term. And it makes people worried sometimes as we talk about, activism and forms of activism. But the reality is that, the way that we're talking about activism in this book and how people partake in it is that we all do these things on a daily basis. If you think about, this morning, if you read a news story, or you turn on television and you watched a news story, or you took a step to educate yourself on a topic today, that means you have partaken in a form of activism. It was a purposeful action. Now, it might not be the most inspirational one or the craziest one that would end up on the news itself, but you are, in fact, being an activist by learning about these things in front of you. And the stories that we tell throughout this book really crisscross Wisconsin history and really were chosen by teens. We worked with a number of teens across Wisconsin by sending out surveys because it was COVID era, and we were able to get their feedback on what sources were most connected to their lives, spoke to them the most. So there's some really amazing stories then that crossed the decades that brought shock and awe to some of our teens as they were really looking at the content. So as you're exploring the book, as we're telling these stories, you'll see that there's kind of a handful of small stories throughout that hopefully many of you are not familiar with, maybe some of them that you are, but we always like to try and make something surprising. And I do always like to say that truthfully, teens chose the contents of this book. In fact, my favorite source isn't even in the book. My favorite source is from not too far away from you all in Wausau. In central Wisconsin, they had a Miss Guernsey pageant, and there's a Miss Guernsey sash that has a Holstein pattern, and it just didn't resonate with our cross section of teens. I thought it was amazing for a drag show to use that kind of imagery and cowbreeds, but it didn't make it through. So you'll see some of those thought bubbles we saw on the previous slide, as well as throughout the book. We will walk through, each of our 5 chapters. We'll talk about one source per chapter today, but most chapters contain 5 to 7 primary sources, meaning 5 to 7 distinct stories that, have their context built out, really cover about 100 years of Wisconsin history and crisscrosses the state. So we're going to share with you those now.
Thanks, Jenny. So let's jump right into some of this source material. And as I go through a source per chapter over the next several slides, I'm going to sort of switch back and forth between reading a little bit from the book and then telling you a little bit about the source itself. So first on our list of types of activism is in chapter 1, educating yourself or educating oneself. What we learn shapes us into the people we become. We are taught by our teachers, families, and friends, but we must also take our education into our own hands and seek out topics that matter to us. This is especially true of topics that don't normally come up in classrooms or in casual conversations. The simple act of reading about people like yourself, if you're not a person who normally appears in those classrooms or casual conversations, the act of reading about people like yourself can be incredibly powerful. The sources in this chapter, chapter 1, demonstrate how information about the LGBTQ plus community can awaken, educate, and inspire in different ways. In 1972, the Ladder magazine, it was a magazine called The Ladder, ran a small news item with the headline, "2 Black Women Seek Marriage License." 1972 was still pretty early in the fight for equal rights for LGBTQ plus folks, not even marriage equality, just equal rights overall. 1972 was just a few years after Stonewall, and it was decades before the fight for marriage equality would really begin to take shape. Donna Burkett and Minonia Evans of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, argued that they were missing out on tax benefits by not being allowed to marry. They eventually lost their court case and were not able to legally marry, but they did have a church ceremony. So that brief article in the Ladder magazine surely had a profound impact on many of the magazine's readers. By 1972, it had nearly 4,000 subscribers who would have seen this article. Some of those readers may have remembered the article 44 years later in 2015, when same-sex marriage finally became legal in all 50 states. So on the slide here, this is a screenshot from one of the book pages, the picture and the little article there. This is what the primary sources tend to look like in the book itself. We really wanted to try to give the teen readers a feel for what an original primary source would have looked like.
So our next chapter then is about telling your own story. And like Kristen, I'll do a little bit of reading from the book itself, as well as adding a little contextual information. So telling your own story can start with reflections in a journal and a diary. And pictured here is Lou Sullivan, who is a transgender gay man born in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin in 1951. During his youth, he dreamed of becoming a writer. At the age of 11, he began recording his life and thoughts in a pink vinyl diary. In his early journal entries, Sullivan recorded his feelings, observations, and desires. He noted that he played boys as an 11-year-old. He explored his identity on the page long before he ever told anyone about feeling like a man trapped inside a woman's body. Journaling is a very personal form of writing, and most journals are not intended to be shared. Often people who journal find it valuable to look back and reflect on the thoughts of their younger selves, and journals can act as time capsules, recording who you were and how you felt at pivotal moments in your life. In the book, we included entries from when Sullivan was 15, 16, and 19 years old, respectively. He continued to keep a diary until his death from AIDS in 1991. And Lou Sullivan started exploring his gender and sexuality by writing in a diary, and he ended up becoming one of the first publicly gay trans men to medically transition. One of the diary entries that we included in the book was written by Lou on March 10th of 1967 when he was 16 years old. And this is what he wrote. I thought of the days when I really thought I was a cowboy. I dressed the part and I really was one. I don't have to dress up anymore, and I'm glad. The cowboy is in my soul where he counts. He doesn't have a name because he's 1,000 different men. Always men though. I really should have been a boy. I'd be so much happier as a boy. I'll probably make a good marriage because my husband will be me and all that I want for myself. I'll treat him as though he were me. Strange. Our next chapter then is titled Be True to Yourself. And, we shared in the book that in the introduction to this part, really kind of outlining be true to yourself, because it's kind of a big idea, right? That doesn't always tie directly to our history when we think about it. But what we wrote was, we can never truly know what it feels like to be someone else. But as you read the primary sources in this chapter, we challenge you to try seeing the world through another person's eyes. Imagine how you might have felt in their shoes. We hope these stories embolden you to take action by expressing your own identity. Sometimes being true to yourself is the most courageous thing you can do. And then one of the stories that we share is the story of Bob and Edgar. And what we wrote was, in rural Wisconsin, two men went into business together so they could live life on their own terms. Robert, Bob Neal, and Edgar Hullum created a world for themselves in Mineral Point, Wisconsin in the 1930s. They opened a renowned restaurant and worked to save the Cornish buildings and history of the area. Their historically preserved houses and built landscape, known collectively as Pendarvis, are now part of the Wisconsin Historical Society. But before Bob and Edgar found each other, they lived together as life and business partners. They forged their own paths as gay men in the early 1900s. Included in the book, and pictured here on the slide, is the first known letter from Edgar to Bob after they met in 1934. Although we don't know the exact events of the weekend when they met, it's clear that they had quite a lot of fun together. The following summer, Bob and Edgar bought Pendarvis House for $10 and embarked on an adventure that would last for decades.
So in chapter 4, we start talking about building community, and communities can be big or small. They can be public or private, formal or informal. And throughout Wisconsin history, and really throughout, the country and the world, LGBTQ folks have long formed their own communities, a wide range of communities, in order to protect, educate, and support one another. So this is a community we talk about in chapter 4 called Lysistrata. Lysistrata was a feminist cooperative in Madison, Wisconsin. It ran a restaurant, bar, and performance space from 1977 to 1982. And by providing a multi-purpose space for meeting, socializing, and entertaining, Lysistrata became a central gathering place for Madison's feminist community, which included queer women as well as feminists of all genders. The excerpt in the book is from an early brochure produced by the Lysistrata Cooperative. Members were trying to raise funds for the restaurant and the lounge, and after they'd raised enough money, Lysistrata opened with a bang on New Year's Eve in 1977. It was an open, airy restaurant by day, serving lunch crowds with a select menu. And at night, the bar opened and patrons danced the night away. The Madison Fire and Police Departments both came to Lysistrata to recruit their first women officers and firefighters. But the co-op was never completely financially stable. The group wanted to provide customers with affordable prices, but it never quite made enough money to cover their daily operations. Around 1980, Lysistrata's founders began seeking other ways to support the co-op. They made appeals to their shareholders for more donations and even considered selling the operation. Lysistrata was set to be sold, although the paperwork had not yet been signed, when the building burned down on January 8th, 1982. And this is something that people who used to go to Lysistrata still talk about today, this fire when it burned down. They have said it was such a cold day that the firefighters couldn't use water hoses to douse the flames, which is why the building actually burned completely down. They couldn't use fire hoses to put out the flames. Lysistrata board members were cleared of any wrongdoing in the fire, but the cause of the fire was never determined. And Lysistrata's community mourned and still mourns the loss of this feminist oasis. Finally, people create change by actively supporting or opposing issues of the present day. This chapter, chapter 5, provides examples of actions that brought about real change in Wisconsin's LGBTQ community. Almost no other event in LGBTQ plus history has motivated individuals to take action more than the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s. This public health crisis resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths in the United States and many millions more around the world. The LGBTQ plus community was devastated by this infectious disease and blamed for it, especially in the early years of the epidemic when many believed that only gay people and drug users were affected. Some LGBTQ plus people with HIV and AIDS were outed without their permission when hospitals called their families and revealed their diagnoses. Some patients' families were not supportive of their sexual orientation and did not allow patients' partners and friends to visit them in the hospital while they were dying. These tragic experiences were recalled in legal battles decades later when gay people fought to gain marriage rights. So now that two people can be considered legal spouses, regardless of their gender, they cannot be barred from visiting one another in hospital rooms. The AIDS epidemic encouraged LGBTQ plus people and their loved ones to become active in many ways. Some worked to memorialize those who had died to ensure that the tragedy of the global epidemic would not be lost to history. In 1987, a group of strangers in San Francisco started the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. The quilt was a traveling memorial to those who had lost their lives to AIDS-related illnesses. Each square of the quilt was designed and created by friends, partners, and families to commemorate their loved ones. The quilt is made up of more than 48,000 squares. If displayed in whole, it would be roughly the size of the city of Sheboygan in 2020. So last year when we did the comparison. Portions of the quilt have been displayed in Madison and Milwaukee, and the quilt visited Madison a couple of decades ago, which is where this picture was taken, which we include in the book. So as Jenny said in the beginning, activism takes many forms and spans a spectrum of ways of making change. The LGBTQ plus people, allies, and activists we read about in this book change the world by educating themselves, by telling their own stories, by being true to themselves, by building communities, and by getting active. These people made their own contributions to a larger movement. Over the decades, their efforts have added up to significant changes in Wisconsin and beyond. Today, same-sex marriage is legal in Wisconsin and around the United States. Legal protections in housing, jobs, restaurants, and businesses for LGBTQ plus people are much more common than they were 50 years ago. In fact, attitudes about gay rights have changed faster than attitudes about almost any other social issue in the history of the United States. Our goal with this book was to educate teens on Wisconsin's unique LGBTQ plus history, the good and the bad. We wanted teens to see how Wisconsin was at the forefront of the gay rights movement when it passed the first non-discrimination law in the country in 1982. And that's something that not a lot of people know about Wisconsin's history. Wisconsin was the very first state to pass an anti-discrimination law against the LGBTQ community. We wanted the teen readers of this book to know that LGBTQ plus people have existed here, going back to the Two-Spirit people among the Ho-Chunk, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. And we wanted teens to know that LGBTQ plus people are still here today and always will be.
So as we, worked our way through this book and highlighted a number of primary sources, there's a large number of sources that really start with court cases in LGBTQ history, and we still see court cases and legislation today. And each generation has had to fight, new battles in this war for equality. But the amazing thing is, as we traveled throughout Wisconsin so far, and met with some teens that were really excited to really learn about the history that has come before the present, to know, whose shoulders you're standing on and how we got to the landscape that we currently are on. Our youth are powerful and resilient, and this book is meant to celebrate their identities and give them the knowledge of the history that they continue to write today.
I have you on this slide, Jenny.
Oh, do you? Okay. I'm sorry. So before we get to questions, we wanted to let you know that there are some actions coming, from the publication of this book, starting with an educational resource that just went live on the Wisconsin Historical Society site this month. And that is, just general ideas, even if it's a book club, if it's a GSA or GSAFE club meeting, there's discussion questions as well as ideas for activities. But it really is meant to be an idea document, and that can be found on the Wisconsin Historical Society site. There's also a traveling exhibit that we're working on right now. And if anybody would like to think about giving us some feedback on some artist proposals that we got in recently, we'll share our email, and we would love to hear from you and have you be involved in the process. We have a handful of teams right now that we're just getting started working with. And then we have a number of talks like this and events across the state. Our October is action-packed, which is delightful to really spread the word about this book and the history that is in it. And then Kristen is our amazing social media person. So she posts and keeps active about what we're doing and where we're at and kind of what's happening in the history of this book on Facebook. So we would love if you followed us there. And you can see our contact information here, as well as our Facebook handle. And I was just seeing if there's any questions. I saw things popping up. And we would love to hear from you now, even, if anybody has any questions, if you have anything that you want us to talk about further, we would love to discuss.
Well, thank you both. I'll take the first question. As you were working on this book, what did the two of you learn about it? And how did this help you as researchers, as librarians, and just as people? What did you learn from putting this book together?
Do you want to go
Kristen,
first?
do you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to take it. We're so kind to each other. We make a lot of room for each other in these talks. So I'll give the first answer that comes to mind, and then if I think of anything else, I'll bring it up. But one of the things that I learned that surprised me, that made me very glad we were doing this project, is that the teens that we talked to did not know a lot of this history. So it really sort of validated the need for a project like this. And I was glad to hear that teens were really interested in it. They just had not been exposed to it or thought about it. At the time, I had 2 teenagers of my own in the household, and so I sort of used them as an informal focus group. And they just had not heard of most of the things that I was talking about, but they thought it was really interesting. So that was surprising and gratifying, and made it all feel pretty worth it. I mean, it was already worth it, but it was nice to hear that this was a necessary set of information. What do you think, Jenny?
And I would say, I mean, I learned a ton about the history of LGBTQ activism in Wisconsin. Kristen had been working at the LGBTQ archive at UW-Madison, so she had a really great grasp already and knew a ton of these primary sources. I did not. You know, I knew a lot about Wisconsin history. I have a strong background in that. I am a gender and women's historian, but not necessarily of this movement, you know, of this time period. A lot of what I looked at was in more like the 19th century. And it was more about like, gender women's rights than LGBTQ activism itself. So I learned about a lot of amazing individuals, a lot of stories, and not all of them even made it in these books. You know, Dick's books are massive and amazing and provide so much contextual history as well. We were really even able to kind of dive deeper, give nuggets with the primary sources, and that's been a lot of fun. So that's what I really learned with this book is some great stories throughout the state of power and resilience and everyday living, which is the kind of history I love, right? That social history. And to tag on with what Kristen said too about kind of our teen reaction, the picture that we, you know, shared on the Power of Teens event was from a high school pride event that we went to in Oregon, Wisconsin. And one of my favorite conversations with a young person was when they indignantly asked us, like, how do you even know this stuff? So that was really amazing and delightful. And people are hungry for this content, I think, like, especially to see people like them lived in the past and these stories that we don't know. You know, we talk a lot about transgender rights right now, and the reality that in our book, you know, we're talking about someone in 1914 in Milwaukee who went to trial for dressing as another gender, and that was a huge topic of conversation in 1914, over 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I have anything else to add. Go ahead.
Okay. Did I hear you correctly that Wisconsin was the first state to pass LGBTQ discrimination laws?
Yeah, so at the time it actually only applied to sexual orientation, not gender identity. That was something that wasn't understood the way it is today, but it was in 1982, which is the year I was born, so 39 years ago. And it was, for a while, we talk about this in the book too, Wisconsin was known as the gay rights state, which is not something that I think a lot of teens today would ever think that we would hear about Wisconsin. But this state has a really proud history, pride. I mean, there's a really wonderful history in this state of the determination to sort of let people live their lives the way that they wanted to and not be discriminated against for it.
And what I'd just like to add too is that, you know, sometimes in Wisconsin history, when we claim, you know, we're the first at something, often people are hot on our heels, right? It's a trend that you're seeing across the United States. We were the only state with a non-discrimination law for a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it wasn't hot on the heels. It wasn't trying to sign something the same day as somebody else, but like 5 minutes before them. You know, it was something that we were ahead of the pack on.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting. And as you were sifting through all of these primary sources, how did you decide what to include in the book? I imagine there were lots of little articles and ads and all sorts of stuff in there. How did you make the decisions on what to include and what to leave out?
So it was a 2-step process, and I'll let Jenny talk about one part of it a little bit more. But First, we wanted to make sure that we had equal representation in a lot of different categories. So we wanted to make sure we had people of different races, people of different genders and gender identities, people in different parts of the state, so rural and urban and suburban and northern Wisconsin and central Wisconsin and southern, south central Wisconsin. We wanted a teen to pick up the book and be able to find somebody that they could relate to in this book in some way, shape, or form. So we were pretty intentional about that at the beginning. And then as we were narrowing down sources, do you want to talk about that, Jenny?
Sure. So we wanted teen input. And we had planned going to a number of high schools and working with GSAs or GSAFs across the state. We had scheduled pizza parties and, thought about kind of getting a group of students into a room, presenting them with the primary sources, having that conversation and having them help us really select, what sources we were going to tell, because we wanted them to resonate. We wanted them to be relevant to life today. And let's be honest, some are super cool, but they don't resonate. They're not, they're not connecting with our youth. And that's really the point of this book, is not necessarily like Kristen's favorite thing or my favorite thing, but truthfully what was going to impact our teens today. So we were all set to go. And then we were also going to go to the GSAID conference and work with a group of people in a conference presentation setting. But then it was March of 2020. So all of those plans went out the window because the entire world shut down. So in a weekend, Kristen and I flipped our script and we made surveys for each of the 5 chapters with all of the sources that we had been thinking about using. We got in touch with then those schools that, we had been planned to go and working with the youth, and we sent the survey out through GSAFE, and we, tried to blanket the state with as many different links as we could to get feedback on these sources. And we were able to get some great gems. We didn't probably have the numbers that we could have captured in person just because the reality of the world and working with teens, but we had some really great feedback. And you'll see that feedback, as we mentioned, in the book itself, because we wanted it to be created with teens, partially by teens. And then we kind of had this, advisory board that we worked with as well. In fact, right before the book was officially published, it was in final versions of writing. We worked with a teen who read the entire book again, cover to cover. And she found some things that, she didn't like about the book. And then we were able to edit it in those final stages as well. So it was a really wonderful process that allowed us to make sure that teens had a shaping influence on this book.
That's great. And I am curious though, without naming names or cities or schools or anything, did you face maybe not opposition, but at least maybe a lack of interest from those, from any place where you sought out feedback? We'd like to speak with some teens about this, and either a district or parents or whoever said, sorry, we're not interested in participating. Did you face anything like that?
Book, we didn't directly, I think, because we put it out there kind of in more friendly channels, right, using GSAFE and GSA. I will say that in my time at the Historical Society, there was a tour that we were going to go talk about kind of core Wisconsin stories. And one of the core Wisconsin stories out of like 35 storylines that we were going to share was this LGBTQ history storyline. And there was a district that asked us not to include that in our options, because it is still contentious. And truthfully, that's also why we wrote this book, not necessarily for teachers and classrooms and curriculum, but more with GSAFE clubs in mind, more with like that direct teen in mind. We created a resource guide more than like a lesson plan or a curriculum, because we wanted to have that flexibility to get in the hands of the teens who need it, because likely it's not going, to be taught in classrooms across Wisconsin. And that's, good or bad, whatever it is, we wanted to put this resource out there.
And I linked to that resource in the chat earlier. I just put it in again to make sure that it went through, but yeah, it's not a lesson plan because it's not intended for classrooms. It's a educational resource guide and like a discussion guide, and it can be used in a lot of different settings. And we certainly wouldn't mind if it was used in a classroom, but to Jenny's point, we didn't want to make life difficult for teachers or districts either. We just want to share this history. So yeah.
Okay. And do we have, I just posted a link. If anybody watching would like to give us some feedback directly on this festival, we'd sure appreciate that. Do we have any other questions? Anybody else? Feel free to chat them or speak them if you would like. So what's next? Is this something, while people are deciding if they'd like to ask questions, is this something that you see could have maybe a second or third or fourth edition down the line? Is this a one-off kind of book, or do you plan to do some updates down the line?
We haven't talked about future editions of the book, although there's something that might be surprising to people is there's plenty of history to fill future editions, plenty of Wisconsin LGBTQ plus history to fill future editions, plus history is being made every day. So more, new history to be included, but we haven't talked about future editions. There is that exhibit that's coming up, and not just this book, but sort of Wisconsin's LGBTQ plus history in general is going to be a main sort of theme that the Wisconsin Historical Society Museum wants to continue talking about over the next several years as they build their new museum. So the topic's certainly not going away anytime soon. Did you want to add anything else to that, Jenny?
No, I think that's perfect and covers it. Yeah.
Nor should it go away. I mean,
nor should it.
I mean, these are issues not only with a long history, but a long future as well, I would imagine. So, well, it's a nice, bright, sunny day out there, so I don't see any more questions coming in. We will leave it there. We will always be here. Kristen Whitson, Janke Kalvaitis. The book is available through the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. Our library here has copies. I'm sure many libraries, both school and public, have them across the state and hopefully beyond the state as well. So thank you very, very much to you both for being here today. We really appreciate your time and for sharing all of this great information with us.
Thanks, Chad.
Thank you so much.
Hope everybody has a good rest of the Central Wisconsin Book Festival.
Thank you very much. Thanks. And thanks everybody again for joining us. Have a nice day.
Bye.